start by putting together a 3-point lighting setup. For this, I like to use directional lights because they're just easy to work with. They're very predictable. So to do that, I'll just go up to Create, Lights, Directional Light, and I only need to go to that menu once because I'm going to duplicate this light. Directional lights work by essentially just saying there is a light infinitely far away that is pointing in this direction. We basically treat them like sunlight. So in here, I just have my directional light, which is displayed as like 4 arrows going in a direction. This is going to be the direction that the light is shining. So if I hit 7, that's just going to put in my light preview mode. And so I can just go through and I can add in a directional light. That's nice and easy. We can treat this as our fill light. Generally, with a Maya software renderer, I try to aim about as close to a value of one unit of lighting, one lumen or whatever it equates to in Maya. So if I have multiple lights, I want them to add up to 1 where possible. So I want to get to the advanced attributes of this light, so I'm just going to press Control A. And the only attributes that I really need to play around with are these on the side here. We have a type of light, which is just going to be directional. Happy to leave that as is because that's what we made it as. We've got a color, and we've got an intensity. Color is a little bit unintuitive because we actually want to dirty up the light to make it a little bit more visually interesting. If we just have pure white light, things can look a little bit sterile, a little bit bland. So think about if you want your lighting to be a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler. So if you're looking at something that is indoor, a little bit more robotic, something with fluorescent lights or that sort of thing, dial it toward blue just a little bit. If you want something that's a little bit more warm, inviting, outdoorsy, tilt it towards yellow just a little bit. So for this one here, I'm going to go for yellow, just a little bit, not terribly much, and not quite the full thing. So maybe something like that, just a little bit off-white. I'm going to put the intensity down to about 0.8. And the reason being is because I'm going to have a fill light that's going to make up a little bit more of that value. So this light is now pretty much ready to go. So in fact, we'll do a little bit of a step-by-step. So I'll just delete this out just for the time being. So first up, I'm just going to do a render. That's on Arnold at the moment. So to open up the render panel, there's a whole bunch of clapperboards here, just in the top row. If you just click on the blank clapperboard, that's going to do a render. If you do the one with the eye, that's going to open up the window and not create a render. So that can be a way of just opening up what you've done previously. So that's opened that up, and I'm just going to change in the top here from Arnold Renderer to Maya Software. Understandably, there's going to be a bit of a dip in quality between Maya Software, which is like the bare bones software renderer, and something that's quite CPU intensive, GPU intensive as Arnold or Renderman. We work with what we've got to work with. So first up, I'm just going to do a render of my character. So what I've done, I've taken a render, but I haven't got a light in my scene. This is because Maya, by default, will add in a light to a test render because if we don't have a light in there, then we can't see what we're actually doing or see what we're rendering. So we do need to turn this off. So at this point, I'm just going to save a screenshot. So just next to Maya Software, there's 2 images. One is keep image, And that just gives me a little scroll bar down the bottom where I can just sort of slide through these so we can see the progression of what we're doing. And so I'll add in my light by just undoing. Okay, and back to that. And in the top left here, I'll click that clapperboard again. Okay, and keep this image and scrub through. All right, and we can see a little bit of a difference between these two things. Cool. Now, at the moment, you'll see that the shadows on this object are super, super harsh. They go to black, which is a little bit problematic. So to fix that, we're going to add in a fill light. So I'm just going to duplicate this light, Shift D, and I'm going to move this offset just a little bit, just so it appears as a separate light. I'll rotate this so that it's going at a 45-ish, 60 degrees-ish sort of angle. I want to choose a color for this that is slightly different to the initial lighting color. Again, you think about if you want your scene to be warmer or cooler. In this case here, I'm quite content with it to maybe simulate a sky a little bit, so I might shift this towards a blue sort of color. And I don't want this to sort of be anywhere near as intense as the original. So I might put this down to like 0.3. So 0.3 plus 0.8 is going to be a bit over 1, but I also bear in mind that they're not going to be hitting exactly the same surfaces. So sort of factoring that in just a little bit. So I'll open up my render again and do another render. Okay, and it's starting to look a little bit like a more solid object, nice lighting, cool. Then third, I'll duplicate this again and add in my rim light. The reason why I personally find rim lights to be a little bit tricky is because they are very dependent on where the camera is. In movies, when you've got something that has very clear rim lighting, you'll also notice that the camera is stationary because the two are super dependent on each other. When you're lighting your scene, on the whole, it's probably easiest to just not have the rim light in there. So if you're just doing a still image, sure. If you want to parent it to the camera as you do that orbit around the character, sure. But yeah, completely optional. So for this, I'm going to crank it up to maybe a value of 2. We want it to be going toward the camera a bit. And I'll just save that image and do another test render. And now we've got that rim happening on that top right surface. So just sort of plugging through a little bit. All right, so we can see how these lights, just 3 lights, have really made the character a little bit easier to look at. So that's basically setting up the lighting. You just have a key light, which is just the main light of your scene, highest intensity. Then you have a fill light, much lower intensity, a color that's going to offset that main light, and then a rim light is optional but can add a highlight to certain edges. Cool. Now let's think about shadows, because shadows make everything look wonderful. We only need to add shadows to one of these lights. Having it on the fill light is just going to sort of like dirty up your scene a little bit more and make it apparent that the fill light is not coming from everywhere, it's coming from a specific source. So we might as well just put it on the key light. So to do that, I'm going to just come down on the side here and we've got shadows. I'm going to open that up and we have 2 options for shadows. We have depth map, which basically builds out a texture and then bakes that into the model. It can get a little bit messy, especially if your UVs are are not perfect. It does have issues with the resolution of the texture that you're doing, but if you're doing a big scene with consistent lighting, it actually works a lot faster because it just makes one texture map at the start and then everything's fine. But what we're going to use is Raytrace. And a ray trace is basically a light source is going to keep shooting out rays at different pixels, different points. It'll do a whole heap of blurring and stuff. And it'll basically say, hey, this ray has hit something. Cast a shadow behind it. Make sense? Cool. So at the moment, this light here already has ray trace shadows on, which also means that the other two have ray trace shadows on. So I'm going to make sure that I turn those off. So I'm just selecting my other two lights and just making sure that they are turned off, because I only want shadows on my key light. The light angle, the shadow rays, and the ray depth limit are basically going to be the blurriness of the light. So in stage lighting, this is to do with the penumbra and the umbra. Umbra meaning dark in Latin. So it's basically like how far away does it fade to black, and then the umbra is black area. So if we change the light angle, I like to put this to like an angle of 3, and that just blurs the shadow just a little bit. So it's sort of turning it into something just a little bit softer than sunlight, I guess. Shadow rays is essentially going to be the resolution of the shadow. So how many rays is the light shooting out at the scene? The trade-off is you'll get much better looking shadows with more rays, but it'll take much longer to render. So I tend to set this up a fair bit, maybe 20, but I keep the ray depth limit quite low. There's a few other options that we'll cover in the render settings. But if I do a render here, you'll notice for one that this is much slower. Oh no, hang on, it shouldn't be slower just yet. Yeah, it's still 6 seconds. But nothing has changed visually since the last one, because we haven't enabled shadows in our render settings. So our lights are all set up. Presumably, we might need to tweak them a little bit, change the shadows a little bit, we'll see. But now we need to open up the render settings. So there is a clapperboard that has a tiny little gear in the lower right corner. This is our render settings. If we open this up, we get our render settings. There are 2 tabs to this. There is a common tab, which is settings that occur or that are consistent between any of the renderers that we use, whether that's Maya Software or Arnold or Renderman or Mental Ray or whatever. And then we have a tab for Maya Software. At the moment, my render using Maya Software. Cool. That means that the settings that we apply are going to apply to Maya Software. Awesome. There will be some settings here. In fact, we'll set these up just for the batch render that you'll be doing, which is like the full sequence that you'll save out. So you don't ever want to save or do your batch render as any sort of video file, because if the render fails for any reason, the entire file gets deleted, nixed, corrupted. So if you do it as an image sequence, if it fails at frame 999 out of 1,000, you still have all the other frames, you just render the last 2. So PNG is like easy, safe, convenient. I mean, when I was learning, we did Targas. They are quite gigantic in file size, so PNG is usually a little bit nicer. JPEG can work, but you have to deal with file quality loss. So yeah, PNG is like just the easiest solution, really. Was right. Because I'm okay. There it is. So now what we want to do is determine the naming convention that we use for these files. At the moment, mine's set to name.extension because it is a single frame. when we're rendering out a whole sequence, we want to have a frame number in there somewhere. The one that you want to choose is name.hash or .number .extension. Don't choose name.extension.number because, yes, the number's in the most logical place, but it's or most easiest place to read, but it's also treating it as the file type now. So the number of times I've done that and had to like shuffle the number in front of the extension. So name.number.extension. You have a frame padding. That's how many zeros appear in front of the number. So generally 4 should be fine. If you've got an especially long sequence that you have to deal with, 5. Yeah, and that will just allow you to not have to deal with frame 98 appearing, frame 12 appearing before frame 120. So it's just an ordering thing. You've got a frame range, start range, end frame. This is going to be the duration of your animation. I don't have a duration, so I'll just leave that at 10, but that might be 280, whenever you want it to stop. You tell it what camera you want it to render through. I don't have any additional cameras in my scene, so I'm going to leave this as perspective. But if you've got a camera that's going to orbit your character, set it to camera 1 or whatever camera you'll be rendering from. Resolution, we'll change this to 1920 by 1080. Standard 1080p resolution, high quality, awesome. The bigger the render resolution, the longer the render's going to take. So if you're still testing around with things, maybe consider just not bumping that up quite yet. An added thing that you can do, and this is more so for when you're working within your scene and working out your cameras, you can go in the top left of the viewport, go up to View, Camera Settings, and in here you can go Resolution Gate, and that just gives you a little bit of a buffer between what you can see and what the camera sees, and it changes it to a consistent resolution, which is really handy. Okay. I think everything else is pretty okay, but the last thing I want to do is just down in render options, I want to turn off enable default light. And that's just going to get rid of that default lighting in the scene. We might see a little bit of a difference in here. Yeah, so that's ready to go. Render. So you see that this is going much slower now, and that's specifically because I've increased the resolution of my frame. At least, yeah, there we go. Show me some of the interesting bits. Stop rendering black. Okay, so this is going to take a really long time if I do all of these tests like this. Yeah, so I'm actually going to revert the resolution back down. But on the plus side, that is some crisp edges on that model. It will be worth the wait once we can set it rendering and then walk off.
The other question is that, is there a way to minimize the noise?
Yeah, I'll be going over that. Yeah. It would be exactly to do with the lighting. All right, so I'm going to save that. Oh no, I hit render again. Okay, I'm not going to say. Yeah, I'm not going to save that, and I will change that back to. You what? Yeah, let's go 520. 520 by what?
980.
I think it was 970 by 540. Much faster. Okay, so save that one. My edges are a little bit janky, but whatever. Whatever. Okay, so that's the common settings done, dusted, frame rates, not frame rates, but like frame durations and that sort of thing. Now we can go to the Maya software tab. So at the moment we're sitting on a custom quality because it has some things turned on, some things turned off. If you want an easy starting point, just set that to production quality. There are still some things that we want to change around. So I'm actually going to go through this from custom. No, let's do it the easy way. So I'm just going to change that from custom to production quality. And let's just do a test render. Okay. So it's cleaned up some of those lines a little bit on there. So it's got something called anti-aliasing on there, where basically it just like samples pixels around each pixel and then blurs it just a little bit. So it cleaned up some of those janky edges a bit. Yeah. The main thing that I changed from here is entirely to do with shadows. So if I open up ray tracing quality, we'll see that we don't have any shadows turned on because ray tracing is not turned on. If I turn on ray tracing, I will save that image. I will hit render, and I am going to wait very patiently. Oh, it's actually going a lot quicker than I thought it would. Ooh, we've actually got a reflection in there. Neat. So I've used blends for my material. Blends have specularity, as you can see, where it's just sort of catching that light. It's a little bit glossy. But we can also see just in here, it's catching the bottom of the cylinder as well for a bit of a reflection. So we can adjust that a little bit there. So I'll save that. That's still running pretty quick, despite the fact that I haven't set up those shadows particularly well, but we'll see. So generally to speed up the render a little bit, what each ray does is after it hits an object, it goes, what's my angle of incidence, what's the angle that I've come in, and the angle that I need to go out, and it bounces around the scene. How many times do we want it to bounce? Well, that's up to you, but every time it bounces, it's essentially doing another ray. So if you have a lot of bounces and a lot of rays, that goes up exponentially, especially if you've got a complex scene. I tend to leave reflections down to like 2, maybe 3, and I'll turn the refractions down to 1. So refractions is if you've got glass in your scene and it's set up to do refractions. Don't stress too much about it. 2 or 3, and refractions usually 1 or 2. Okay, and that should fix up some of that stuff. Some of the speed, anyway. Okay, cool. Maybe my... So maybe my light, or my fill light here is just a little bit too strong. So I'm just going to delete that and just see... In fact, I won't delete that. I'll just change the angle of my key light. Yeah, so I'll cover that in just a sec. Okay, so I'm starting to see some shadows being cast, like in this little section here. There's a very... it doesn't look like a shadow's being cast there. So I'm just saving that. So it's casting a shadow on one object. Oh yeah, there's a shadow there, it's just very faint. So in which case I might take my key light, my fill light here, and just decrease the value of that a little bit. So I tend to find that this is a very responsive way of going about it. So it's a lot of back and forth, do this, change this, fix this, and just seeing how things look, essentially. What I might do is put in a plane down the bottom. Go on, go on. Okay, yeah, so I am casting shadows. They're just quite faint. I can adjust my fill light if I want those shadows to be a little bit harsher. That's fine. But yeah, the other thing is sometimes you can have stuff in your scene that's really, 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 really slowing down your render times. This can be stuff like, hey, there's a whole bunch of trees off in the background, or little decorative bits that are just bouncing around a lot. So what you can do, and I'll just do this for the floor, it's also useful if you've got a sky dome in your scene, which is just like, here is a dome that is blue, maybe has some mountains painted on it or something like that, just to fill in the background a little bit. I always need to find this because it's never in the spot that I think it is. Right, so if you press Control A to go into the attribute editor, in here there is the name of the shape, and it's just like, it's not the name of the object, it's the name of the object shape. Anyway, in here there is an option for render stats. If you open that up, there is an option here for cast shadows, receive shadows. You can also do things for like other render options. But if I turn off receives shadows on this, so we can see that we've got a shadow currently being cast on it. If I render again, it is just going to ignore receiving shadows. So, and now it's a solid color. It just totally ignores, well, it ignores ray tracing, essentially, being cast upon it. It will still give shadows. So in that case, like, I can just turn off cast shadows. So if you turn off cast and receive shadows on a sky dome, that means that it's just going to appear the color that it needs to be. So in this case, I don't want the floor to cast a shadow, so I'll just have it receive shadows. Yeah, and that's pretty much set up how I would set this thing up. I can do things where I build out a bit more of a nice scene. So like sometimes I make a cube to sit around the whole thing. Yeah, I'll move my camera. I'm going to delete out 3 faces and just hit this with a bevel. So this will look a little bit different now because the rays are going to bounce off of the backdrop. So like I tend to like to do this sort of like soft screen behind things when I do test renders for stuff, just to see how lighting interacts with stuff. Yeah, but that's basically the settings that I go through for a Maya software setup. And I think that looks pretty okay as far as our purposes go. When I use materials, I usually like to use blends because even if something doesn't have reflections or specularity in there, I can turn that off of the blend, but I can't turn it onto a Lambert. So just something to consider with that. Yeah, any questions about it?